Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a DADCAW. It is the 19th of August, 2020, Wednesday. More than halfway through the month. Of course, I expected to have a DADCAW out sooner than this very moment, but time catches up to you. So, I actually want to talk a little bit about that because it's sort of time management, one part time management, and one part life management, for lack of a better term. So, what I'm talking about here is, of course, a sort of balance between input and output. And I may have actually spoken on this before in a DADCAW context. Dad context. It's hard to keep track of everything that I've ever said in one of these DADCAWs, or more accurately, any sort of topic I've ever broached in detail or otherwise. But suffice it to say that input versus output is something that I definitely have had the pleasure of looking into in the past, and just have a lot of experience with on a more visceral level. And what it means, essentially, is that there's a certain amount of time that you spend consuming content. Usually other people made that content. Usually you're not consuming your own content. Because if you do that, well, I just mean in terms of actual time spent, right? But when you do consume your own content, it's a bit of a muddying of the waters because you're engaging a different part of your brain, usually a more retrospective and analytical part of your brain than you necessarily engage when engaging in somebody else's content. But of course you can mix and match the two. Obviously output is when you're making your own content, and then there's another way to mix and match is when you're actually creating content via consuming somebody else's content, which is like me doing a let's play of a campaign, be it official or otherwise, for StarCraft, or a let's play of some other game, be it I don't know. Think back to the old Ass Creed 3 playthrough I did, or whatever it was. It was Ass Creed 2, the sequel to the sequel to the sequel, because that's not confusing, but it is 3. So, yeah, we had some junk there. You know, we did some playthroughs, and that was essentially us creating content via playing somebody else's content. But we're still really heavily modifying the end result because it's us playing instead of somebody else playing. It's our commentary as probably the defining factor about the playthrough itself. The role that it's serving is a different one than if it was an uncommentated playthrough, which is usually for users to educate themselves. And it's obviously different if it was somebody else playing it at all, entirely, and it wasn't us playing it at all. So there's ways to mix and match your input and your output. And it's actually usually some combination thereof. It's very rarely binary, but input versus output is something that I have not had that much time to balance in the recent month or so. In particular, I've obviously been doing this daily grind for the better part of a year now, and that started on the 3rd of November of last year. And like I said earlier, we're already more than halfway through August, so we're coming up on the anniversary. So it's something to be thinking about anyway, is the whole daily grind aspect of the ordeal. And how much time are you really leaving for everything else? On an average day, I would say my stream lasts somewhere around 3 to 4 hours. And that means that for those 3 to 4 hours, and for the immediate time surrounding it, because it's more than just what you put in the actual stream, it's also tagging it and adding the metadata and publicating it later. It's getting prepared to do it in the first place, which doesn't take too much time, but it's still got to factor in. So even if we just round down and say it was 3 hours a day, because that's still 3 hours a day I'm not spending on anything else. I mean, that's a movie and then some. That's a movie and a long break in between acts or something so that I can go take a shower or something. That's a real large amount of time that you could use in a variety of other cases. Now, knowing me, I would probably just use it on more output. But the idea is to balance it out so that you recognize that you've done some output and you think about what to do with the rest of your day. That isn't necessarily related to creation, right? Could be maintenance. I mean, this is something that we didn't really talk about. We're just talking about content here. But if you were talking about something completely unrelated to content, and you were just going to go eat, you're going to go make food, which is sort of output, but it's not like a creative kind of ththing. Usually, I mean, whatever, cooking is kind of creative, but you get the idea. It's not for the purpose of doing anything other than maintaining an aspect of your life. In this case, your hunger, or you're shaving, you're showering, you're doing all this other stuff. That's housekeeping or maintenance for your body. There's housekeeping and maintenance for your literal house, like cleaning your room or doing your laundry or whatever. There's all these different things that you can do, that you should do, that you obviously, in many cases, have to do. There's obviously going to work. There's, that's maintenance for your life so that you don't, fail on all of your bills. You don't default. You don't whatever other fancy schmancy bankruptcy terms you can come up with. You don't do any of that. So there's plenty of things that you can do, and in some cases have to do, to balance everything out and to make sure that you're maintaining your lifestyle. And then there's the time that you don't have that's not related to maintenance, right? Now, the problem is that on a conceptual basis, I would look at the rest of my day after my mod stream was done. Now, in my particular case, I start with the mod stream usually. Like, not usually awake for a very long amount of time before I start the mod stream, especially lately where I've been getting up later, which is obviously something I would like to remedy. And a core element of this problem for me has been that after the mod stream, I don't interpret the rest of the day as having already done a big part of the work that I have to do that day, that I've carved out. You know, I've satisfied a certain requirement in my day with the mod stream. I do and I don't. I conceptualize it in some ways with that because it's one thing off the list of things that I have to do. But I don't interpret the rest of the day as a mixture of time that I can relax and time that I can consume other people's content, and time for maintenance and time for output of other kinds, like making other content, like the DADCAWs that I'm recording right now, for example, the CSGO stuff on the second channel, like the whatever else it might be, you know, just working on projects off stream or whatever. So there's many different things that I could interpret it as, like, oh yeah, I have a couple hours to do that as well later on, but I also have hours to spend just chilling and just relaxing. I don't really know what it means to not be doing work is the problem. And that's something that I've realized lately, that for me, I haven't really dedicated a large amount of time to, for example, watching movies and stuff. There's a brief period of time, a couple months back, where I watched a couple movies, and it was like, I don't know if it was every day, but it was 3 or 4 days out of a single week. I think I watched 3 movies. So, or at least 3, maybe it was more than that, because 3, but at the end of the day, or at the end of the week or whatever, I basically stopped doing that at some point because, you know, one thing led to another, and suddenly I started working on a bunch of stuff. So finding and forcing essentially a balance in that respect is always difficult. And just finding a little bit more time to unwind and not necessarily engage in projects and just, you know, do whatever I'm doing, but pay entirely all of my attention going towards whatever it is I am doing. Like, there's certain things that I can mix and match. Like, while I'm working on a project, maybe I have a podcast in the background. That's sort of mixing and matching your input and your output. But there's very rarely any point where I'm completely zoned in on an input. Or, yeah, on an input. So it's very rare that I'm watching a movie, for example, nowadays. You know, that hasn't happened in months. And during that time, it was a kind of a job of my own, a task that I had to follow, where I was forcing myself to focus on just whatever the movie was whatever's going on in the movie. Like, just, it wasn't really an attention thing, like not an ADD thing or whatever. It wasn't a lack of attention span. It was making sure that I was engaged with it, like I was really paying attention. And a lot of like some movies, it's easier to do that than the others, because some movies, they don't really compete for your time. And you kind of find that out pretty early on. And maybe I should just drop them in that case, but sometimes I would finish them, and sometimes I'd be like, you know, I'd find a different strategy to remain engaged. I'd be like pointing out all the flaws in my head, like keeping track of when maybe the special effects weren't on point, or, you know, sort of mocking the delivery of the actors, or something like that. You know, finding some flaw to latch onto and pay attention to, and still remain engaged in the art, if you can call it art at that point. Remain engaged in the piece at that point, and try to keep myself focused on that, because it's important to be engaged in whatever you are doing, if it's input or output or maintenance or whatever. It's important to do it purposefully. So I found that I was constantly trying to latch on to stuff like that, and that was quite rewarding in some respects. I mean, if it was a really high quality project or product, then I'm engaging in something that's actually worth it, right? I'm engaged in something that is justifying its own existence. And if it was something that was comedically bad in some way, then that has its own rewards, where it's obviously derisive, but it's still rewarding to watch in that respect. Just maybe not in the intended demographic there, not in the intended manner. So obviously movies are one way that you can be having some sort of input as opposed to having some sort of output. Obviously, video games are another way. I would oftentimes have a podcast in the background while doing some Counter-Strike deathmatching or whatever. That's a very common one, actually. And sometimes, most of the time, it would just be against bots, honestly, because that's one of those things that I'm not really interested in playing against players. I think generally I have a better time when it's more or less nonstop action. And deathmatch obviously has all those pauses and stuff, even in a community server. So I would just have full control over an offline server with bots, playing on some community-made map, usually, finding some fun way to do it, either in a deathmatch game mode or in a defusal game mode or whatever. And I would have my fun there. It wasn't very mindful. It was rather brainless in many respects, actually. But I was fully engaged because Counter-Strike requires you to be engaged. And I was also having some sort of input with the mental stimulation beyond what because obviously the opponents are not forcing mental stimulation out of me. They're fucking bots. But the mental stimulation is coming from the podcast that I'm listening to, be it the Lex Friedman podcast or the fucking Dark Horse podcast or whatever, all these other podcasts that I would listen to, sometimes Joe Rogan. And so there's these podcasts that I would listen to. There's these games that I would play. Of course, sometimes I'd play StarCraft, play Hydra, do some build order practice, do some team games against AI and stuff like that. That's a little bit harder to pay attention to a podcast in because that does obviously engage a bit more of your attention. You have to come up with strategies and stuff. You can't really go on autopilot as much, I find anyway, in StarCraft. At least in Hydra, I haven't really tried in vanilla. But these are strategies that I would have to unwind, to have some sort of input. And again, when you're playing your own project like Hydra, it's one of those things where I'm also constantly thinking about stuff. So I am kind of engaging with the material in a way that isn't really input. It's actually kind of output because you're coming up with creative ideas or whatever. Whereas anything that I think about in Counter-Strike's context, stuff I can't actually act on. It would be like, oh, I can tweak this setting here, or I can do this little thing here, or maybe I could make these bots do something a little bit different. I have no control over that. It's almost a blessing in disguise that there is no actual Counter-Strike AI modding in a feasible, in a reasonable manner. And as a result, it's all super low level. I would have to do a ton of work into it, and that has prohibited me from even bothering trying to look into it. So it's actually a blessing in disguise because I'd probably just fucking tunnel vision on that too. Whereas it's actually a bit of a danger because recently I've downloaded Halo Reach on PC, and there are modding tools for that, and it doesn't look like they're terribly easy to use for somebody who's never used them before. Well, maybe the tool is easy to use, but the fields that you're editing are not very well documented. Some of them are unknown. So you got to look up obscure fucking videos. You can't even look up how to mod Halo Reach because half the things are just these clickbait articles that this epic mod lets you play in third person in campaign. And I'm looking at how do I edit AI? How do I place AI? How do I edit maps in a better way than fucking Forge, which is just allows you to pre-place objects and stuff. I want more control over that stuff if I'm going to do it. And maybe it's a good thing that there doesn't appear to be ways to do that, at least not in the way that I would like to, not to the degree of freedom that I would like to and the degree of complexity that I would like to, because that would just lead to me spending all my time that wasn't dedicated to Hydra and Deliverance and all these other projects that I'm working on. All that time would instead be dedicated towards building a Halo Reach total conversion where I completely rebalance all the weapons and vehicles and create AI and try to rebalance the AI, rewrite the AI, make it so that the enemies are actually worthwhile and threatening and, all that stuff. I would actually love to do that. I'm getting hyped up just talking about that, but that's something that I so far cannot do. And maybe it's better that it stays that way just for my own work-life balance. Again, input-output balance in that sense. So, because as long as Halo remains, and as well as Counter-Strike, and to some extent the Brood War stuff, as long as I have products that I can just consume, I can just play, I can just have that as my input, there's going to be some balance there where I'll always be able to fall back on that. But even that recently was not something I was doing a whole lot of, and that's something to point out too. So in a way, this DADCAW is kind of a reawakening or making myself a bit more aware of the fact that input versus output is important, and hopefully wording it in a way that was somewhat entertaining and also a little illuminating so that you yourself might be able to put some of these ideas in practice. Now, I have not really experienced the inverse of this, I should mention, because it's kind of an interesting topic to get into, just because I don't really know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to not input, or not output, rather. I don't know what it's like to be on the other side of this balance where you're mostly inputting and not doing much creative work yourself. If most of your life is input and maintenance, that sounds like hell to me. So I honestly could not really align myself with that. Like, I guess in my mind, that would mean that whatever input that I would be doing, like, I guess it's different. I should make a distinction if you're playing a game and it's competitive, what you're doing, like you're competing at a high level, like you're a top esport professional, or you're grinding to become something like that. That is different necessarily, because that is your output then, like that's your job. So it's kind of maintenance in the finances department, but it's also your passion in that sense, and it is what you're pushing yourself towards. And it's not, you're not engaging with it to unwind and to relax, and that would be the input side. You're engaging with it because you want to improve, and that's where you get output, which would be like me doing some practice drills in StarCraft or something, or aim practice in CSGO or something like that, right? That would be something commensurate to it anyway. And so that's the output side of things. I think that there is probably a whole different kind of conversation that I could have if I somehow knew how to tap into the mentality of somebody who wanted to output more, but found themselves like basically having some sort of gaming addiction or something, or maybe not addiction, maybe that's too strong of a word, but like a preference for just playing. Like they would just blow off whatever they were supposed to be outputting, or whatever they thought they were supposed to be outputting. Like obviously this kind of has to come from you yourself. You have to be able to discipline yourself. You have to be able to motivate yourself. So in that sense, I'm not really even sure where to begin with that. But the idea that maybe you're somebody out there who you kind of want to make stuff, like you have some creativity to you. You have that creative personality in you, or creative bone in your body, or whatever. Like you kind of got this idea. I have this idea that I think would be good, and I can kind of see a way to actually implement it. It just requires work and time, and I'd rather just play stuff. Like maybe that kind of person. I'm sure that those people exist. Presumably some within my own audience. So maybe they could shed some light in the comments or on the Discord server or something like that. That seems like an interesting idea to actually go down. So, and just an interesting rabbit hole to explore, I suppose. So there's an idea for you anyway. If you have some sort of thoughts based on that, or if that's a perspective that you yourself found, you were constantly working on stuff, or wanting to work on stuff, but constantly playing stuff instead, or constantly, input instead of output. Where you wanted to have that be more balanced in favor of the output, whereas I'm talking about bringing the input up a little bit, but not obviously still mostly output, but just a little bit more input, just for the sake of balancing, like just so that you don't go crazy. That would be nice. So yeah, I'm talking about something very different, something very personal to me in that sense, where I imagine that there are people out there who suffer from the same thing that I was talking about, but it's presumably a small percentage of the population, just judging by how much shit actually gets done and how many people actually work on something day in and day out that isn't related to their job. So yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it there for now. Obviously got a little muddled towards the end. And overstayed its welcome, but that's DADCAW for you. So thanks for hanging out. And yeah, tell me about you actually in the comments. All right, see you next time.